I know that we're all anticipating the lineup this morning. We're talking about illegal immigration, counterterrorism, and the very important topic of reporter safety in the field. So, with that said, I'll step aside and invite John Burnett up to introduce his guests. John?
Thank you, Howard. Would my panelists like to come and take a seat? Well, good morning to everybody, and this is a great crowd for a Sunday morning at 8:45. You could be reading the New York Times and listening to Weekend Edition Sunday, so thanks for being here. Let me just start off a little bit off base. I've worked out of Texas for a very long time now. It is an endlessly interesting place to cover the news. I have to tell you, when I started in 1986 in Texas, public radio was not well known. I was doing a story on a cowboy church, and I was at Billy Bob's, Texas, the largest nightclub in the world, and I was recording some bull riders before the Pentecostal preachers came the next morning to be there. And so the announcer was sort of thrilled that I was there recording, and so he said, well, we're very thrilled tonight to have John Burnett here from National Public Rodeo. True story. And somewhere on an old cassette, I actually have that recorded. And I want to tell you that in the years since, that was like 1987, we are much better known now. And I have witnessed in this quarter century the development and the maturity of public radio in Texas, which is so exciting. And I just want to ask all my people from Texas to stand up right now, okay? Wow, we're here. So it's not all coastal. There's a third coast. KERA, KUHF, KUT, KSTX, KRTS, Marfa Public Radio. These are fantastic stations with strong news departments, and when I go around the state, I cross paths with their great reporters all the time, and it is an absolute thrill that we've arrived. So, having said that, and the reason I love to be in Texas is because there's always something happening down there. I think the great Molly Ivins, God rest her soul, there was a competition for a license plate slogan. It was "Drive Friendly the Texas Way," and Molly suggested Texas, land of wretched excesses. So once again, it was the summer of 2014. I have covered the U.S.-Mexico border for a very long time. I'm fascinated by it. It's like a different world. I've lived in Latin America. I've always got my ear to it. I'd covered a lot of waves of different immigrants who've come across over the years. But nothing quite like this summer had ever happened before. Texas does share the longest piece of the U.S.-Mexico border. We have 1,200 miles of it. And so here came these unaccompanied minors from Central America, and then mothers and children. So we want to talk this morning about sort of two things that are intimately interrelated, and that's the humanitarian crisis, the border surge of this summer, as well as how that influences this enormous question of what are we going to do with illegal immigration that is brewing right now in the big building next door with all the Secret Service men in front of it. So let me just give you kind of an overview of what got us here, and then we'll go to our excellent panelists. So covering illegal immigration at the border means just kind of watching it move episodically through the decades. In the 90s, it was all about San Ysidro and the West Desert and images of people sort of running across the land border. In the 2000s, it was the Tucson sector was the hot spot. That's where folks were crossing there, heading to Tucson, heading to Phoenix, dying in the desert. And then, as the Border Patrol, now Customs and Border Protection, was able to gain operational control of the West Desert, the land desert, the non-river border, everything moved to the Rio Grande Valley because, again, we've got this border which does this. The topography is just crazy. It's jungle, it's agricultural fields. There's a levee that's a half a mile from the actual river. It's a very complicated place to try to seal the border, and we'll talk about that in a second. So it was in around May or June of this year is when the humanitarian crisis that Obama declared peaked. Let me go to my first picture here. So this is Jorge Romero, who's a 16-year-old from El Salvador. This was Anzalduas Park, which is in Hidalgo County in Mission, south of McAllen. This was like ground zero. This is where, I drove up and I thought I was so excited because, I'd been there, and there was CNN doing a live shot. So this happened every day, all day long. Jorge had come up from San Salvador on his own. He had ridden the Tren de la Muerte, the train of death, up through Mexico. He made it. He made it with all of his limbs. He was just emotionally wrought. And this is a constable from Hidalgo County who was calling the Border Patrol to come pick him up. Let me just play you a little bit of the beginning of my piece.
You can talk more. You can talk more.
Like a marathoner at the end of a grueling race, young Jorge Romero sits on the ground, fatigued, 100 yards from the Rio Grande. He's been detained by a county constable. For a month, the 16-year-old from El Salvador traveled through Mexico, avoiding predatory police and gangs, warding off mosquitoes and hunger.
Yo primeramente no sabía, venía perdido.
Looking like he's on the verge of tears, Jorge explains how he waded across the international river at the tip of Texas, then wandered for a day looking for a border officer to surrender to. Like most young migrants, he gives a push-pull explanation for the journey. He left Central America to avoid conscription by street gangs and to join his family in the U.S.
Por una parte bien porque ya llegué aquí al destino que tenía planeado.
In a way, I feel good because I arrived at my destination, he says, smiling wanly. If God wills it, I'll get political asylum. I don't want to return to El Salvador.
So he was one of the 1,200 individuals a day who were being picked up in the Rio Grande Valley. In June, there were nearly 26,000 kids like Jorge, 17 and under, as well as mothers and children. And this is what it looked like. You remember the pictures now. The Border Patrol, even though this had been happening gradually for 2 years, they were completely unawares, relatively unawares, that the surge was going to happen when it did. And so you had pictures of all these kids and mothers stuffed in these holding cells, which were not really set up for, to have wall-to-wall people in them. And so the nation's attention turned to this. And then this misinformation campaign began as different elected officials decided to take advantage of this headline. And so let me just take a second to thank you all for what you do to keep the public radio network healthy and vital and keep me fed and gasoline in my tank, because our job this summer was to try to truth squad all of the ridiculous information which was being passed. Let me just tell you a little of it. We heard Ted Cruz saying that everyone was here to take advantage of President Obama's amnesty. We heard Governor Rick Perry and Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst say that they were coming to commit crimes, that ISIS terrorists were right behind them, and that they all had communicable diseases. And then we heard from the Department of Public Safety that the cartels were actually sending them as decoys to distract the Border Patrol so they could run drugs across the river. In fact, what they were telling us is that they were fleeing the most extreme kind of violence that teenagers get involved in Central America, which is that they were being extorted. A gang member would come up to them and say, "Call your mother," in Dallas who owns the Salvadoran restaurant. They would talk to mom. They would say, "You need to send me $10,000 or I'm going to put a bullet in your son's head right now." So this is one reason they were leaving. Mom was bringing them up because their lives really were being threatened, and they hadn't seen their mothers, and in some cases their fathers, for 5-10 years. They were infants when their parents left. They came north to join them, and they were looking for economic opportunity once they got out of school. But there was a certain savviness to this. They did realize that there was an element of catch and release. There was this law in 2008, which was actually written for victims of forced labor and sex slavery. But when these kids came from Central America, as long as they weren't from Canada and from Mexico, the law said to give them that they were not to be sent back. They were to get their time before an immigration judge to make their case for asylum, and that they were to be turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services in the least restrictive setting. So effectively, the word on the street in Central America was there was a permiso. And so that's why they would actually look for Border Patrol agents to give themselves up to, which was a unique experience. When I talked to a coyote in Matamoros, he said, "We love these clients. We don't have to get them all the way to Houston. We just take them to the other side of the river and they give themselves up to the first guys in a green uniform." So this law in 2008, which I have to tell you, I was one of the first journalists to talk about it. I got to be invited on the Stephen Colbert report. I'm wearing the Colbert tie right now. And so they did a little segment on some of the illegal immigration happening this summer, and so I talked. This law actually was a bipartisan law. It was signed by President George W. Bush before he left office, and so Colbert's comment was, "How did Obama get to Bush?" So here we are now. The crisis has largely subsided. The numbers are way down. Yet nevertheless, the takeaway from what happened this summer is that it revealed how terribly broken the nation's immigration system is, and how we were really not ready to deal with this influx. And so the calls have been renewed, as we know, for more border security, for what to do with illegal, unauthorized immigrants. So it's really what happens now is the really interesting thing that this border crisis is kind of pointing us to. So having said that, let me finally get to my really great panelists, and thank you all for sitting through this. First, we have Doris Meissner. She's the former commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service under President Clinton from 1993 to 2000. Among her accomplishments, reformed asylum system, worked to better manage the border security and improve naturalization services. Today, she's a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. Sitting next to her is Dr. Guillermo Cantu. He's a senior policy analyst at the American Immigration Council and author of lots of publications on immigration policy. He teaches the sociology of immigration at Georgetown University. And Steve Atkiss, former chief of staff for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, former special assistant to the president, George W. Bush, in the White House for operations. Now he's a national security advisor and a principal at a Command Consulting Group, which is located here in Washington, D.C. Thank you all so much. So I want to start with the fact that, here we are, USA Today, Obama, GOP, spar over immigration. I'd like to start off with you, Doris. Why is it that decade after decade we continue to have these ferocious battles over illegal immigration in this country?
Well, I guess I would start by saying that we're an immigrant nation. We know that. We always say we're a nation of immigrants. We're very proud of that. But this has never been easy. We look upon the heritage that we have with this gauziness when it happened in the past, because it turned out well and we can all in some way or another trace our roots to an immigrant heritage. But it's always been controversial. It's always been very difficult. Congress has never been able to act in a timely fashion to adjust our statutes and respond to immigration. And that's the case today. Most of us and most people of our age in this country grew up in a period in the 1950s and 60s that is an absolute historic low historically in our immigration. So our vision of the country and our experience has been one of stability and not of change through immigration. But that began to change in the 60s and in the 70s. And we are now, beginning in the 1970s, living in one of the 4 peak periods of immigration in our whole history as a country. And so it's an intense element of our national life. It's bringing about change, dramatic change, in the way that it always has been in the past, but not in a way that we as a population have experienced personally. It is a change from Northern European white majority country to a country that is becoming a majority of minorities. The notion of minority is going to have really no meaning in another 10, 20 years. And change like that is very, very difficult. So the change is difficult. It's underscored by the fact that today's immigration is both a legal and an illegal immigration. And so the change itself is difficult as on its own, but the fact that a great deal of it is coming about as a way in which, through ways in which we as a country didn't choose through legislation or any other democratic methods, it offends people deeply. That this is a violation of the rule of law, along with the fact that it is something that is making us look and be a different nation. Now, the fact of the matter is that immigration has saved us as a country every single era in which it's occurred, in that it keeps us competitive, it is an enormous comparative advantage that we have as a society in terms of renewal, revitalization, all those kinds of things, but it is not easy as it happens. And it is complicated by the fact that, as I said at the outset, the Congress is broken too, is unable to grapple with this system that is broken, and so you really have a perfect storm in a negative way.
Guillermo.
Sure. I think that Doris' overview was great. To that, I would add, yes, illegal immigration is a complicated situation. It's less than optimal. Pretty much no one that I know of would be happy with that situation. Like, we all feel like this shouldn't be occurring in the first place. But what happens is that the way it is usually portrayed, it involves a lot of oversimplification. So the notion that people come to this country because there is an insecure border as the only explanation of the phenomenon, I think does a lot of damage. Because as a response of that interpretation, what follows is an immigration policy that has been almost exclusively focused on making the border more secure, and by that, the only policy that has been really in place is putting more resources into building a wall, a stronger and more secure wall, so people would not be able to literally cross the border and come into the country. So what happens with that is that that kind of interpretation overlooks a lot of the deeper factors that explain why people would decide to make that journey or come here and overstay a visa. Why is it that's happening? You can imagine if you put yourselves in the shoes of someone who is living in the country illegally, that's not something that anyone would be happy with. It's like, do we want to be living in these conditions in a country? So why would someone put yourself in that situation of be an undocumented immigrant in a country, in any country, and live in the shadows? That's really not an easy choice. And I would say, as a sociologist, I try to go deeper, and I feel like every individual choice has very little agency, and a lot of our decisions are very much constrained by broader factors. So if we don't pay attention to the contextual situation in the countries of origin, why is it that people don't choose to stay in their countries of origin? Why is it that they feel pushed to migrate into a different country in these circumstances, risking their lives and making these very dangerous journeys most times? Well, the conditions in some of those sending countries are really, as John was describing earlier with the Central American crisis, for example, what was happening in those countries was really something that we have a hard time to imagine here, living in this country. A lot of people have not been exposed to those situations to fully understand what's going on there. There's lots of violence. There are not economic opportunities to make a living, to be able to raise your kids, to educate your kids. And when you feel like you have no choices, migration sometimes ends up being as the only choice. I usually show a film in my immigration class in Georgetown to discuss what's happening in these countries of origin of migrants. And there is a movie that the director goes and interviews a lot of kids in a community in Mexico. And so this person asked the group of kids how many of them had relatives living in the US, and every single one of them would raise their hands. And then he asked them if they see in their future like the possibility of making this journey or migrating to the country. And pretty much everyone had that as their perspective of how their future would look like. So it becomes, as for most of us, our kids, like going to college is like a mandate that we feel like that's going to happen, and we don't question those decisions. Like that's one of our steps in our lives. Well, migration in some of these countries becomes one of those naturally expected steps that one should accomplish as we move up in our lives. So there are like some expectations there. There are some macroeconomic conditions that provide very limited opportunities for people's well-being and for people making a living in those conditions. And then there are job opportunities that are created in this country that also operate as a magnet for these migrants. So historically, the US labor market, even when we are like facing like economic crisis, have been a very powerful incentive for people to migrate. As we said before, a lot of these people have family members in the US. That's another factor that explains why people would decide to go to another place, and that place happened to be the US. And then we have immigration policies that have not been effective in dissuading people from coming to this country. But that's just one piece in the whole picture. And so I think that sometimes all these other conditions get overlooked, and too much of the attention is focused only on border enforcement, and then that clearly hasn't been effective in putting a halt in this process of massive migration especially from Central and American Mexico into this country. So I'll stop here, and then we can go back.
Good. We're going to get to border enforcement in a second, because that's a big topic. But Steve, you want to?
Yeah, well, first of all, I definitely agree with everything that the commissioner and Guillermo said. I think, unfortunately, as far as where we are right now in the public dialogue on this topic, we're stuck in the broader context of the challenges we have as a political system, and in terms of just more broadly as far as how we talk about issues publicly as a country. And that's one of the things, by the way, I love about NPR, is the ability to kind of peel back beyond the conventional wisdom and the stratification. It's either this or that. And this really is, I think, on this issue, a perfect example of kind of a false choice that we usually are presented with in these big public policy debates. And in this case, the false choice is between we either value our country as a nation of immigrants, or we're a country that's going to take the rule of law seriously and enforce the laws that we do have. And to me, that's a bad choice. It's a false choice. There's a way to accomplish both of those, and I agree completely with what the commissioner says. I think one of the fundamental values that we've had as a country historically has been in terms of focusing on immigration and being a pro-immigrant and a welcoming society is very important. It's one of the things that makes us strong and creates the diversity that has gotten us through the challenges that we faced as a country. But we've also always been a nation that values due process and rule of law. And the problem is how we've gotten to this point now is that we've neglected these systems almost forever, and certainly in recent history. It really wasn't until September 11th where you had kind of something smack you right in the face that said, geez, can we really have a system in place as a country that doesn't allow for the visibility into who's here, who's coming, and who's leaving? If you think about, what we're really trying to drive at is who's here in this country. It's a simple math equation, which is a plus, a minus, and an equals, and the plus is who's entering, and we have a pretty good sense of that now in the air environment, or people that are coming, through our ports of entry. The minus is who's leaving, and just as probably the most stark example of the lack of investment traditionally in this country in immigration or border security infrastructure, we've never had an exit process. And this is, I'm sure, a very well-traveled group, and you know that any country that you go to anywhere else in the world, when you leave, people are verifying that you're leaving. You go through the airport, you just don't go through security, you go through exit immigration. So there's a process of saying, so-and-so's leaving. We don't have any of that in this country. We never have. When you drive from where John lives in Austin into Nuevo Laredo on I-35, you are on the interstate until you get into Mexico. We don't know who's leaving this country. We don't even know in the airport really who's leaving this country. So that's just one example. In the border security environment, we're talking about actual people that aren't coming through the ports of entry, but that are crossing over. That's something where, you've always had dedicated individuals in the agencies that are responsible for border security, but they've been so dramatically under-resourced in the history of our country that they've just, done the best they can with very limited capabilities, both in terms of the number of people that are working on it, and also in terms of the resources that they have to buy things like technology or to invest in what we call tactical infrastructure, which is fences and lighting and things of that nature. So you're trying to make progress on this very complex issue in a very difficult political environment and even just kind of public dialogue environment. But you're doing so not from a kind of steady state where we have a pretty good handle on things, where we're trying to make progress from very little to something that resembles, a real security system of any sort in the country.
Okay, let's hold that thought. So every time the immigration debate comes up again, we have the perennial trade-off, and that is, certain Democrats, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, we would like a path to citizenship. We would like to expand amnesty for some unauthorized immigrants who are already here. And then immigration hawks come back and say, not until you seal that border. And I spend a great deal of my time trying to figure out whether the border can be sealed or not. During George W. Bush, the Border Patrol was doubled in size. Washington has spent $2.3 billion on 649 miles of steel fencing in sections between the U.S. and Mexico. This is Pamela Taylor, who lives on the other side of the border fence outside of Brownsville. She is in this no man's land, or no woman's land, between the fence and the river. And this is what she has to say about the efforts of the government to protect the country with a border fence.
If you ask Pamela Taylor about the big rust-colored fence that tops the river levee near her house outside of Brownsville, she won't mince words. Has the border wall worked?
I can't speak for the Border Patrol. For me, it seems like a useless piece of crap. Take a look. They're walking over. They have boats lined up on the other side of the river to row these people across.
So Steve, I want to start with you on this one, since this is what you have spent so much of your career doing. Can the border be sealed? Is the answer more fencing? Is the answer, as we have heard again, to double the size of the Border Patrol?
I think it absolutely can be done. Just like most things, it comes down to a matter of where does that objective fit in the context of our national priorities. And so, we tend to be, in terms of the public dialogue, in terms of our political system, one that's focused on the crisis of the moment. And so it may be our ability to provide, quality care for, returning war veterans that's hot today. It might be, our attempts to thwart ISIS and what they're trying to do tomorrow. Border security absolutely can be done. It's just a matter of, are we as a government and as a people placing a high enough priority on that's where we want to put our resources. It can be done. It's very difficult. It's very complex. And it's very expensive.
Then why do we keep getting it wrong? And every time this debate comes up again, it's like the border's open, the border's porous.
Well, because we address it in kind of an episodic way. And so it's a hot topic for some period of time. We have an influx of resources, and then we move on to the next topic. And so if you look at what's happened, and I'm sure the commissioner can give her perspective from when she was focused on these issues in the 90s, but there have been kind of three major pushes, one in each of the last this decade and the previous two. And so during the 90s, the effort was really around, as John mentioned in his opening comments, taking these urban environments and securing them. And so, this is a gross oversimplification, but it used to be, before the 90s, that you literally could go sit in a coffee bar or in a bar, more likely probably in Tijuana, and you had pretty good visibility into what was happening, on the border, and you could wait for the Border Patrol shift change when the vehicle would go in the other direction, and you could kind of make a run for it. And just as an individual, without any support, without any sophisticated smuggling network assisting you, you just had to get to Tijuana, and then you could kind of figure it out. And guess what? If you made a run for it and you got caught, well, that was okay, because you might spend a couple of hours in custody, but they were going to just put you right back into Mexico, and you just try again. And so the effort in the 90s was really to take those urban environments, whether it be Tijuana and San Diego, or Juarez and El Paso, Nuevo Laredo, Brownsville, Matamoros, and make those much more secure. And so you see things in San Diego now like double layers of fencing with Border Patrol agents in between, and lots of cameras and lights and things of that nature. And it was, by and large, a very successful effort, but you had a surge of resources to go do that one time, and then we kind of moved on to something else. I don't know what the next topic of interest of the country was. Same thing happened in the mid-2000s, and that's when I was there, which is our biggest problem after the urban environment was the desert environment. So you had, it was much more complicated, and by the way, resulted in a lot more kind of humanitarian issues and people dying in the desert trying to do this. But you could pretty much get out into rural Mexico, which on the other side of Arizona, and you could drive a vehicle across the desert, and it was a long way, but you could kind of four-wheel off-road across the desert until you got to a highway in Arizona. You were effectively in the United States. So the effort there was, okay, let's put up vehicle barriers, let's get people out of their cars, so it takes much longer, and you're talking about multiple days hiking now, and let's get the right equipment, technology in place such that we know people are out there and we can go over this period of time and apprehend them. And by and large, that's been done. There's certainly a lot more work to do in the desert environment, but that's been done in the kind of mid-2000s, at least the low-hanging fruit. Now, as John said, you've got a very different challenge, which is the river environment. And you have, in the park there in Hidalgo County, I've been there many times, maybe the best example. You have, development on the Mexican side that's right up to the river. You have on the Texas side, literally homes and restaurants and things of that nature that overlook the river. And it requires a very different challenge and some creativity, but in the end, it's resources. And so we go through these big resource influxes, and then we kind of move on to the next topic. And we had this big one in the 2000s, perfect example, and we doubled the size of the border security workforce, essentially, not just in the Border Patrol, but in other areas as well. We spent billions of dollars on very high-end military-grade technology, if you will. And those people that we've now put in there are, if you look at the budget of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which has this responsibility, the people take up about 93% of the budget. So they've only got 7% of discretionary money, and most of that is actually not discretionary to invest in taking on the next challenge or so on and so forth. So in the end, it's a question of, is this a high enough national priority in the context of all of our other national priorities that we're willing to put in the money that it's going to take to really provide that level of security, and it's a huge investment.
Commissioner, how did you try to tackle this when you were in the government?
Well, let me try to put a different lens on this in terms of how to understand border security, because it shouldn't be a question, can we seal the border? We don't ask 100% effectiveness of any law enforcement endeavor that we do. We ask that it be managed effectively so that public safety is in fact ensured. You don't expect in New York City or Chicago or DC to have no murders. What you expect is to have a police effort and all that goes with it that keeps that at its absolute minimum. I think that we are on the southwest border pretty much at that point. I don't think that we can pour more resources into southwest border enforcement and get much additional measure of return. I'm going to just give you one number because it is so dramatic. Today we spend $18 billion a year on border enforcement. That is 24% more than we spend on all other federal criminal law enforcement, which means the FBI, the DEA, the Secret Service, the ATF, the Marshal Service. We have a situation now on the southwest border where this crisis this summer was really not a crisis of border enforcement. This was a situation where kids were coming, still are, but at very large numbers, to turn themselves into the Border Patrol in order to have access to a hearing and get, by and large, reunited with their family members in the United States because of intolerable conditions at home. That is not evading law enforcement at the southwest border. The numbers are low on the southwest border now in terms of apprehensions. It is by and large being managed. Now there are things you can tweak. I agree with Steve in terms of technology, people, et cetera, but the Congress and the American people should be taking credit for what's happened at the southwest border. We have supported on a bipartisan basis Republican and Democratic presidents and Congresses since the early 1990s historic levels of investment in border enforcement. You can't do the job of managing illegal immigration just with southwest border enforcement. In fact, almost half of the people that are in the country without authorization came with visas and overstayed their visas. The southwest border is only part of the issue. So we've got this laser focus on addressing illegal immigration by U.S.-Mexico border enforcement. That has been accomplished to the extent that it can where illegal immigration is concerned. We've got to put other policy measures into place.
Great. You're about to lose
I know,
the
this
microphone
is,
there.
I don't know.
And one of the things, when you talk to Border Patrol agents, they will also echo what the commissioner said, and they'll say, don't look at us to completely seal this place up like it's some sort of Jurassic Park fence that you can electrify and keep everybody out. They said, why don't you start doing some interior enforcement? Unless you do something about this enormous draw of all the employers who are looking for unauthorized immigrants as dedicated, inexpensive employees, you're not going to stop this. So I wanted to ask, do we need to get serious about interior enforcement to talk seriously about stopping illegal immigration, Steve?
I think I agree with the commissioner. It's not just purely, and if it sounded like I was trying to frame it that way, I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's a system of a lot of interrelated things, and certainly interior enforcement and border security are two important parts. There's others as well, by the way. To me, it's not kind of an either-or choice. We have a broken system where forever, instead of acknowledging that that we need a certain degree of immigration and want a certain degree of immigration to include from south of the U.S. border, and having a process in place, a real process that people have some confidence in, to Guillermo's point, that they feel like they do want to immigrate or need to immigrate to the United States, that we're acknowledging that and have an application process that people follow and pursue as kind of their way of legally entering the United States. We've never really done that. We've always kind of looked the other way as a country to say, well, we know we need it. Let's not have the right resources to enforce the law because this is something that we want to happen for these reasons. And September 11th, to me, is the kind of turning point that changed that a little bit, which says we really do need a good sense as to who's entering the country for a lot of different reasons. So what I'd like to see, not to jump too far ahead, is a process that acknowledges that and that has a legitimacy to it. And then coupled with that, a process that makes sure that we've got the right resources to make sure that people understand the two things that are the factors that I think impact ultimately your decision to come here illegally or not. And that is, first of all, the certainty that if you try, you will be caught. And I agree, we've made a lot of progress on that. It's a lot more difficult, which creates other challenges than it used to be. But I would say we're a long way from certainty that you will be caught. But the second one, and this is the one that the commissioner is referencing as far as this last crisis this summer, is the certainty that when you are caught, you will be returned. And we have an issue now of, and this is what created this, I think, in this past summer, is by and large, people who show up here illegally, who we can't handle quickly. Oh, by the way, again, we don't have the investment. We haven't made the investment. We don't have the capacity to be able to detain people in a humane way until they can go through the judicial process and so on and so forth. So we say, again, this is another one of those wink and nods. Hey, we don't have the capacity to detain you in a humane way, so we're going to go ahead and release you into society with the notice to appear. And we know from that 90% of the people that are given that notice to appear and released into society never show up for their hearing. So we're just kind of continuing to whitewash the fact that, look the other way on the process that we're putting in place and saying, oh, it's okay, we're going to release them with a notice to appear when we know 90% aren't going to show up. So to me, to get over this, we've got to address all these things, and it does involve border security, it does involve immigration enforcement, it does involve judicial capacity to be able to give people fair hearings to understand what their circumstances are and determine whether they have a legitimate kind of refugee claim or other claim that would allow them to go through a process other than the one that's established where you can go apply for, a green card or, a work visa in the United States. And all those things have plenty of opportunities for improvement, most of which involve a significant amount of additional resources than we've historically placed in them.
So you've kind of turned us toward the no-show rate, and which is where we're going with the next question here, and that is, it is a problem that when immigrants are apprehended and given notices to appear, or their claims fail and they are given a notice for deportation, the rate is very high and of no-shows. And the way that the federal government has begun to deal with this, they changed their policy really just a couple of months ago. And they've reinstituted family detention, which is an extraordinarily controversial way to do it, which is detain and deport. So whereas, as I said in the beginning of this session, at the beginning, the mothers and children who were coming across the border were put on those buses in McAllen and told to, you can go to your relatives and we'll give you a notice to appear, come back to immigration court. Now, if you cross, they're building the largest family detention center in the nation, in Dilley in South Texas, about midway between San Antonio and Laredo. It's going to house, when it's full, 2,400 women and children. It's going to be the most expensive detention we've ever seen in this country. It's going to be $298 per person per night. The ACLU calculates the average cost of most immigrant detention is $166 per immigrant per night. And so this is what we call in Texas a man camp. This was oil field worker housing, the grounds of it. They're now building these supposed to be family-friendly jail, and I love this. Immigration and Customs Enforcement is calling it the South Texas Family Residential Center. However, a jail is a jail is a jail, even if you paint rainbows and have a snack bar. So I'd like to bring Guillermo into this.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you, so the idea is that if you detain these women and children, the word will get back to Central America, don't come. It's supposed to be deterrence. And so is this a practical policy? Do you think this is going to work?
I think there are a number of issues with this, and there are so many other issues that Steve mentioned earlier that I wanted to respond to, but I hope we have a chance to go back to some of those larger issues. But when it comes to family detention, that has been very controversial for a number of reasons. First of all, a prison is not the right place to have a family spend some time, and when that time, it's an irony the way they are calling this place. But in fact, people who have been observing and visiting these detention centers like Artesia in New Mexico have found horrible things going on because, first of all, this that is meant to be a place where people spend like a few days end up being a place where people spend a long period of time. So there are some problems with that. And some people have come up with alternatives to detention, some ideas that may actually address some of the issues that people have with the no-show rates that Steve was mentioning earlier, that I don't know where that number is coming from, but I've seen other numbers and I don't think the no-show rates are that high. But in any event, I think that, for example, electronic bracelets have been proposed by a number of advocacy groups as an alternative that would allow the government to keep track of where these people are and make sure that they can locate them when they need to show up in an immigration hearing. But most importantly, I think that we have to acknowledge the fact that this country has to honor some of the principles that it has embraced, like asylum and giving an opportunity for people who claim that they are fleeing persecution in their countries of origin to make their case, and if there is evidence, allow them give them a chance to apply for permanent residence in the country. If all we care about is removing these people from the country as soon as possible, we may not be giving these people the chance to make a case. Mm-hmm. And so we may end up sending them back to terrible conditions that may lead to their death. And that is not something that the country is known for. So I think that there is a delicate balance there, but it is important that we take into consideration that a fair process means spending some time, and during that time that processing the cases takes, allow these people to live in conditions that are better than being in jail. Most of these people, as the Commissioner mentioned earlier, have their families here, have family members. So it is much better to have them stay in their homes, and it's cheaper also for the country to not have to invest lots of resources in maintaining these kinds of facilities when there are alternatives and more effective ways to deal with this problem.
Okay. We've got one big last question here before we go to questions from you all, and I want to make sure we give everybody some time because this is the big one. What happens next? As we know, there's almost 12 million illegal immigrants for a variety of reasons, some who crossed the Rio Grande and some who overstayed their visas. This week, President Obama rejected the advice from the top congressional Republicans that he delay what he said is his promised executive action on immigration reform. He's already delayed this twice, to the great consternation of Latino groups who are protesting in Lafayette Park right outside of here. The Republican National Committee, the head of it has said that if Obama gives amnesty by executive fiat, he'll be throwing a barrel of kerosene on the fire. He should be impeached at the least. He'll ruin chances for any bipartisan cooperation with the new GOP-controlled Congress. So, very fraught issue. I'd like to ask our panelists, starting with you, Commissioner, what should we as a nation do?
Well, as a nation, we should be putting a rational immigration system into place, and that requires legislation, and that has not been possible. And so the right answer is not the answer that we're able to be dealing with at the present time. You know, in terms of the immediate challenge and the immediate confrontation that is already in place within 24 hours after the election, where we were going to get bipartisan cooperation, we first just try to deal with the language. Nothing that is on the table right now where executive action is concerned qualifies as amnesty. The only thing that the executive branch can do is what's technically deferred action. It can basically decline from deporting people who might otherwise be deportable because of their illegal status, and that would take the form of a deferral of deportation, most likely the ability to get a work permit so that people can work legally in the country, and most likely the ability for people to travel back and forth in the country. And that is what most people in an unauthorized status would be very, very pleased and satisfied with. That has nothing to do with green cards. That has nothing to do with path to citizenship. The executive branch has no authority whatsoever to go there. So all of the charges about the president creating an executive amnesty are you know, completely mischaracterizing what could actually happen. That said, if the president does go ahead and create a major deferred action for potentially millions of people in an unauthorized status, even if it's only 1 or 2 million, up to 3, it seems to be they're talking more of something in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 million of the 11 million of people in the country who don't have a status. That would be an extraordinary and pretty unprecedented action. And all of the legal analysis on this does pretty much concur that he has the legal authority under what's called prosecutorial discretion to take an action like this. But the scale is really dramatic in terms of what the immigrant groups and Latino constituencies are demanding and what will be considered, as has been already said this week, putting a red flag in front of the bull. So the parties have really, really put themselves into a confrontational stance on this knowingly, purposely, because the president needs to deliver something beyond deportation to a huge core constituency in the Democratic Party, and it is a constituency that will probably be the tipping point, if not in 2016, possibly even then, certainly 2020 and 2024 in our politics. And of course, as we know, Republicans are losing that constituency just in very, very large numbers. So we're talking about high politics here. We're talking totally, I think, about politics rather than an issue on the merits. And they are staring each other down, and it really is a question of who's going to blink. And I must say that the argument, and I don't intend this to be a partisan statement at all, But the argument that the Republican leaders are making at this point, that they will deal with legislation if the president doesn't provoke them to the point that it's impossible to legislate, really is pretty hollow based on the record. I mean, it is absolutely true that there has been an enormously broad opportunity to legislate on these issues, even, just in this last Congress. So I think that we are probably going to see the president take a pretty substantial action. I don't think that it will be as broad as what the constituency groups are asking for, if only because it cannot be implemented at the numbers in which people are demanding, for the reasons that Steve has said. This would be an action that would have to be carried out through the current system. Congress would not only not appropriate money to make it possible to handle millions of applications, it will try to prevent money from going into anything that has to do with millions of applications for a work permit. So the last thing the government needs is another Affordable Care Act rerun in terms of a big program that then fails through the implementation of it. Moreover, it's entirely possible that even if 3 or 4 million people could be eligible for work permits and a deferred action application program, that far fewer of them would actually apply than among the dreamers who have already had that opportunity, because it's at the end of an administration. There is an enormous amount of mistrust within the community that this would be withdrawn as soon as another, let's say that there is a Republican administration in 2016. At least that fear is very strongly held in the unauthorized community, and given how controversial this is and polarized it is, it's a more legitimate fear than has been the case 2 years ago for the dreamer population. So I'm not giving you an answer on what I think we should do, because I don't know what we should do.
Well,
I know on the merits what we should do, but we can't get there. And this is, at this point, a real high politics issue, not an issue on immigration policy.
That's as good an analysis as I've ever heard of what he's facing. So this is great. I'm like reporting. I'm getting ideas for stories from her. So we do want to leave time for questions. So, but if you all, the rest of the panelists, starting with you, Guillermo, if you want to take a shot at that.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with Commissioner Meissner that a sustainable solution can only come through Congress and through legislative fixes, not through executive action. However, given that we've been waiting for the last few years, and especially in the last year, we thought someone was about to come from Congress, but it never happened. I do think that there is some hope in what the president may announce. I do agree that whatever he announces will be limited, and not only because of the resources that it would take to implement like this deferred action program, but also because what this deferred action would do would be mostly formalizing and standardizing some enforcement practices that are already happening. I don't know if you're familiar with the way that immigration law enforcement is carried out today, but there are some priorities. So not every single undocumented person in the country has the same level or fits within the same level of priority in terms of deportation. So some people who are in the country who have strong ties, no criminal records, are very unlikely to be deported today. And so what this executive action would do would be to formalize that so there is no discretion on the ground. So it limits, even though the name is discretion, the executive discretion, what it actually does is limits the amount of discretion that exists in enforcement on the ground. So that's important to take into account. I do think that there are some limitations to whatever the president can do. If anything, defining which category of the undocumented would be benefited by this initiative would create some problems, because how do you decide? I think that in the children who arrived, or the young people who arrived here to the country as children, there was a very widely accepted justification of why you choose that group. Now, when you expand this into other categories of undocumented immigrants, I think that that will create some challenges, and it remains to be seen how that will be resolved. I do think that it would give some relief to the problem. It's going to be really an issue of buying time and see what Congress is going to do. I don't think it's one or the other, even though sometimes it's portrayed like that, and some people use that politically to actually not do anything. We started this discussion by saying, what should we do with to fix illegal immigration? I think that there are different options that people have exposed here in this panel. What is clear to me is that the worst thing we can do is nothing. So I think that that has been the case for a long time now, and hopefully that will change.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, the president actually has very limited abilities here. And I think if anything, we're in a problem where the expectation has been created that he actually has the power to do a lot more than he can. And Guillermo's right. I mean, what he can do is essentially formalize guidance to his enforcement resources as to who he wants them to focus his attention on deporting. That's not new, by the way. I mean, we've been doing that for a long time, going back for many presidents. And in the Bush years, the focus was on criminal aliens. So we were prioritizing the very limited enforcement resources, not on the mother of the student who came here legally and then got citizenship, or on the children of someone, but on aliens who had, committed a criminal act and were therefore kind of, exposing the American public to violence. And that seems like a great idea if you've got limited resources to prioritize it towards that. And so it's been done. By the way, it has a bunch of unintended consequences as well, where we're taking people who have been here in the United States and learned in the School of American Prisons how to run criminal organizations and so forth, and sending them back to Central America. And we've seen what's happened there. A lot of those same people have basically taken over those countries. So it's not that they're ever easy choices, but the president has that discretion, and I think mostly you're doing it for political effect, because the president's been exercising that discretion for a long time. As far as what we really need to do, again, this is caught up in the context of everything we need to do as a country and should be doing as a country. We need to get the kind of radicals on both sides out of the picture and get the reasonable people in the middle to have a rational discussion about this. How practical that is, I guess I'll set up a table here afterwards and take bets from everyone on what it's going to take. I mean, but practically speaking, I think in terms of the context of our politics right now, you have to have some system, and this is exactly the same as what it was 10 years ago, which is one of the frustrating parts, of course, where you can give a reasonable degree of certainty that we have a secure border. And you have to pair that with a process whereby people who have been here for a long time and been productive parts of our society and functioning as part of our society have some pathway where their status is legitimized. And those are the two things that ultimately need to come together. But there's a lot to that, and a lot of interests that have concerns about both of those two things. And there's a lot of resources on the border security side. I think, again, that's my view of the world. Generally is on the border security side. We're not talking about a small investment. We're not talking about kind of token symbolic things to be able to say we're doing for border security. To really satisfy the concerns of people who do understand the border and who are focused on border security, you're talking about a lot of resources and a long-term commitment to do that, and whether we're willing to do that or not as a country in the context of other priorities is a huge question.
So I guess you're suggesting that the Congress not name Louis Gohmert as the border czar? Okay. We have time for about 12, 15 minutes for questions. So please step on up. We got microphones back here.
Hello, my name is Carol Hertzberg, and I'm from San Diego, actually Del Mar, very close to the border in San Diego. So it's very important, well, actually to everybody in the room. And I was so impressed that we were having actually a rational discussion. It sounded to me like everyone was on the same page. But Commissioner, you alluded to, you know what the solution would be. And so if you could just share with us, the three of you, what the solution would be if we were rational about this. I'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
You know, I think we've actually covered that. I think Steve basically alluded to it. You know, we need legislation, and it needs to have, you know, it needs to cover a lot of topics, including the border and interior enforcement. There's absolutely across-the-board agreement that you have to have a decent enforcement system, but you also have to have legal ways for people to come to the country that meet the country's needs, and you need to find a way to regularize the status of the large unauthorized population who's here.
Thank you. Thank you. This is an excellent presentation by all of you. My question is, the round numbers I hear are that there are about 1 million illegal immigrants a year and about 1 million legal immigrants a year. The economy and society seem to be absorbing a substantial percentage of the 1 million illegals. Is there any talk about dramatically increasing the amount of legal immigration beyond the work permits, which would be part of that, but just simply bumping up the number of short and long-term visas and opportunities for immigrant status or legal immigrant status? And the second part of that would be, you didn't talk about the U.S. trade unions. How do they feel about all this, and what are their positions?
Do the numbers. Yes, we always forget the fact that about 1 million people a year immigrate to the country legally. But the numbers of illegal immigrants and the flow of illegal immigration is dramatically down from what it has been since the early 1970s. And this is just not appreciated at all in the public discussion, and certainly in the congressional debate. I mean, illegal immigration was traditionally running up until the mid-2000s, maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 to 500,000. That is way, way down. I mean, a series of structural factors have kicked in now that make it, I would even go so far as to say, and this one has to really understand what I'm trying to say here, but the era of large-scale illegal immigration from Mexico is over. And it's over, and that's been the issue on the southwest border. This last year, in terms of apprehensions at the southwest border, apprehensions of Central Americans outnumbered apprehensions of Mexicans. That is a historic change of enormous proportions. Even so, the Central American countries taken together are about 1/4 the size of Mexico, and they're coming for different reasons. They're coming to get picked up for all the things that we've talked about on this panel. So where Mexico is concerned, you have the recession, which has not ended from the standpoint of jobs that were available to Mexican migrants prior to the recession. But you have this series of changes in Mexico. Lower fertility rate. Fertility rate is now the fertility rate of the U.S. Growth of the middle class, good growth of the economy in Mexico. People are no longer leaving. The demographic curve has changed. The large number of people are now over the age of 15, not going into the labor market. And then you have U.S. enforcement. U.S. enforcement has made a big difference at the southwest border. So we're just not dealing with the same kind of issue And we are very well positioned to pass legislation that would create, in terms of our immigration circumstances, that would create visas and a flexible system for coming to the country for work purposes that more proportionately balances coming to the country for family connection reasons, which is the way our immigration system now works.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
So basically, one thing that I think is important to take into account when we think of the numbers is that our current immigration system is very, it has a fixed number of legal entries allowed each year. It allows for a fixed number. So what the Commissioner was saying was, like, I think one of the most important points that the Senate bill last year was addressing, which was that a modern immigration system that reflects the needs of the economy should allow for some flexibility. So when the economy is growing, we are in a position to admit more immigrants, and when the economy is contracting in periods of recession or economic crisis, we admit less immigrants. And what the legal system didn't do so far, the illegal system was doing, which was when you look at the business cycle long term and the flows of illegal immigration, they tend to vary hand by hand. So when the economy was going down, we had much less undocumented immigrants coming into the country. When the economy was in a very, very strong in the 90s, we had tons of undocumented immigrants coming to the country. So the question was also about the unions, where they stand in that. I think that last year we witnessed a very exceptional moment with the unions and the Chamber of Commerce and representing lots of businesses in the country, agreeing on this issue. We need to have a system that is flexible. We need to have an entity that can regulate the flows of immigrants and how many immigrants we admit each year. And I think that the basis for that consensus was that the discussion shouldn't be about a fixed number. The discussion shouldn't even be about the numbers. The numbers should be determined later on by some government agency that is able to look at economic indicators and see what the shortages are in the labor market, and then adjust the system in a more sophisticated and better informed way so we can bring in new immigrants when the economy really needs them.
Okay. Ma'am?
First of all, I want to thank you. This has really been a very enlightening session. And I would like to ask the question that is really a positive question. I appreciate the fact that you've said, Commissioner Meisner, that the situation is thus, that it's pretty doable. I mean, we're at a point where there are no extremes, and we can sort of handle this. We've also heard that there are resources available. Even though the millions or billions, there are resources to prevent. So my question is, can we think positively and come up with innovative opportunities, disruptive, innovative opportunities that can deal with those individuals who are coming across and want to join their families and so on, and their age is either school age or perhaps slightly post-school age? And can we educate them? Can we provide a network of education at the border instead of this building that they're building as a rest home prison? Create educational facilities using our wonderful nonprofit network, whether it's Teach for America or whether it's the myriad of educational programs that are going on where young men and women, older men and women want to volunteer and teach. Can we bring them down to the border? Can we create an educational network that where these young people, these individuals, are dignified, and one way or the other will become valid, giving members of our society.
Okay. Commissioner, do you want to take a, this is going to have to be our last question because they've got to get ready for the next panel. Please stand by and talk to us when we get off the podium now.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there are a lot of things that we can do, and in fact, the real immigration story today is all of the extraordinary things that actually are taking place at the community level, where integrating these very large numbers of new Americans are happening. I don't think that one would do it just at the border. I think one would do it throughout the country. But it still has to happen within a legal framework. And the legal framework is broken, and it is not serving our purposes, and it will continue to create a barrier to unleashing so many other really effective, positive things that can be done and are being done, but against great odds.
Mm-hmm. Guillermo, any ideas on a novel, a fresh idea to incorporate these immigrants into national life?
Well, I do agree with what was said before. I think that, yes, nonprofits are doing fantastic things with very limited resources sometimes, most of the time. And I do think that the U.S., for the most part, hasn't had a very formalized policy framework to incorporate immigrants into the country in general. So it has heavily relied on the labor market that has offered people work opportunities so they could make a life here. I think that there are a lot of wonderful ideas that are being discussed about how to better incorporate immigrants in general. When it comes to this, like the unaccompanied minors, the children who are coming to the country, I think that there are a lot of interesting initiatives that are taking place at the local level. So we have welcoming communities all over the country, across the country, in areas that haven't been known for being communities of immigrants, and they have taken the lead on attracting and incorporating immigrants and seeing the benefits that immigrants can bring into their own communities and trying to use them, immigrants, as a factor for local economic development. So I think that some of the lessons that policymakers at the federal, national level are coming from their own communities, because a lot of the positive and interesting changes are taking place in the local communities. And so it is hopefully going to inform what's happening at the federal level.
Okay, we've hit our time post, 10 o'clock. Thank you all so much.